This is the Human Action Podcast, where we debunk the economic, political, and even cultural myths of the days. Here's your host, Dr. Bob Murphy.
Before we dive into the interview, folks, let's take time for this important announcement. Join the Mises Institute on April 26th in Phoenix, Arizona, as we expose the danger and waste of bureaucracy. Bureaucracy is both a weapon and a weakness for the modern state. While it regulates, spies on, and controls almost every aspect of our lives, it's impeded by its own incompetence and waste. As Mises warned in his book, Bureaucracy, quote, "The ultimate basis of an all-around bureaucratic system is violence." And as Murray Rothbard said, what bureaucrats and power elites always want is for the opposition to shut up and go away, to obey orders, to accept their assigned tasks. Well, we don't plan to shut up or go away. Join Dr. Robert Malone, Tom Woods, and Tom DiLorenzo as they discuss the psychological operations and bureaucratic control, the madness of COVID-era public health, and the corruption and hypocrisy of our federal bureaucracy. Tickets are $100 for Mises members and $120 for non-members. Register now at Mises.org/Phoenix25. And here's your chance to win a free ticket. Enter the raffle at Mises.org/PhoenixRaffle25 by April 1st. Winners will be announced the week of April 7th. Erick, welcome to the Human Action Podcast.
Great. Thanks for having me.
So why don't you just explain to the folks who you, because on this series, Erick, I don't do like an intro where I explain who the guest is before going in the interview. So this is the first time people have heard from you. So please just explain your position and what we're going to be talking about in this interview.
Sure. I'm the founder and CEO of Próspera, Erick Brimen. And what I do through Próspera is we are the promoter and organizers of economic freedom prosperity zones, which seek to maximize economic liberty, rule of law, and legal stability as a tool to drive economic development as a for-profit endeavor. Very different than the typical approach of charity or government or multilateral-led. Before this role, I participated in various entrepreneurial endeavors, some of which I led, some of which did okay, a lot of them didn't. I was in finance before, but what I'm doing now is my truest personal passion. I consider it a life mission to figure this thing out. How do we deliver the service of governance in a manner that actually results in a huge net positive? Through personal observation and academic study, I realized the importance of that foundational layer, but I wanted to transcend just the theory of it, the academics of it. I want to truly leave behind a system that transforms the paradigm for how something as important as governance is done and results in net value to human society. By enabling humans to be human, which means to operate with freedom in pursuit of self-interest, trading voluntarily, and as a result, everybody being better off. I'll just close by saying that my intellectual journey starts with a young kid being born in Venezuela, me, and going through the motions of wanting to do something about what I thought was injustice in poverty and lost potential. And I went through the journey of altruism, of socialism, of various isms, until I eventually realized that, you can't solve this challenge from within the system as it is. And therefore, we had to do something outside of it, but compatible with it in a similar fashion as you might do intrapreneurship within a corporate environment. You can't have a massive institution be entrepreneurial all of a sudden. So it is a life mission, and ultimately what I want to do with this, yes, it has to be profitable for sure. That's a measure of objective value in a very moral way and in a pragmatic way. But more fundamentally, I think if we break the code, building on the shoulders of giants that have come before us, many of whom are philosophers that the Institute celebrates, I think we're so darn close. We're just at the edge of proving in practice how this can work as a very profitable endeavor. And then it gets replicated, not because of philosophy per se, but because of self-interest. We're so darn close that this could be the dawn of a new age of human prosperity throughout the world.
Well, great. So I'm just looking at your website and it's saying visit us. So some people might have thought you were still talking about, yes, this is our plan, but right now people can go visit Próspera. Is that the way to describe it?
Yes, our first city project is, in reality, it exists. It's on the island of Roatan, which is a Western Caribbean island under the Honduran national oversight. And yeah, right now we're hosting a Crypto City Summit. It's a fantastic time to come. This weekend we'll have all sorts of speakers and presenters. We had a regenerative medicine summit before. We're going to have a human enhancement summit later on towards late February. So it's an ongoing destination for thinkers, for doers, and we're literally building a city as we go.
So what's the legal status? It's an economic prosperity zone in agreement with the Honduran government. Is that the way to think about it?
Yes, the genesis of it legally is building on the special economic zone model, creating political subdivisions of the state, which are granted with a very significant degree of legal and regulatory autonomy. So there's still a state apparatus. So it crowds out other dimensions of the state. It creates a nice big sandbox where we have devised a system of governance supervised and approved by the Honduran government that gets as close to what we think it's, I won't call it perfect, but it is Maya. So most advanced yet acceptable in the world as is. Really pushes the boundary towards individual and economic freedom, yet it's acceptable in the world of international trade, in the finance space, in the healthcare space. So it's an interesting mix that we've tried to, we've tried to thread several needles, but it's a political subdivision of the state of Honduras within the Honduran national and sovereign territory that allowed the Próspera governance framework to be the rule set that governs commercial activity within the zone. This Próspera governance framework is intellectual property of sorts. It's our mode of doing business. It can be deployed elsewhere as well.
Okay, great. So just to expand on that, I like that the acronym you used there was Maya.
Yes.
Can you say what that was, just in case people missed it?
Sure. Most advanced, MA, yet acceptable, YA. So often, philosophers or entrepreneurs, whomever, you're thinking, what is the way it should be? Like, what's the best version of, in the world of governance, right? That governments should or should not operate. And that's fine. Like, we definitely entertain those thoughts and have our idealistic perspective, a utopian vision, but that's not what you implement on the ground. You have to implement on the ground what's still within the boundary of acceptability if you want to do it in reality. And we definitely want to do it in reality, are doing it in reality. So we try to ground ourselves through Maya. What is the most advanced that is yet acceptable in the world as is or will be soon?
Okay, so let me just say some things here and you tell me if this is wrong. So the reason right now, people might be surprised and say, well, geez, if I was brainstorming and trying to think of an area that was going to be hospitable to liberty, it wouldn't have been Honduras. But is part of the trade-off because to get a government to go along with it, the people coming in and financing the operation have to be much wealthier than their average citizenry to be able to do win-win arrangements. And, the government likes all this outside investment coming in, whereas you couldn't have struck a deal like this with the Canadian government because it wouldn't have been as attractive to them as they would have given the concessions that the Honduran government. Is that the way to partly understand why this works?
No, not really. There's a different paradigm involved here.
Okay.
First, the value of liberty is both a personal imperative. It's almost like a moral foundation, right? It's the way it should be as a moral foundation. But beyond that, in economic terms, economic liberty maximizes generalized prosperity, right? And the more of the former, the more of the latter, right? Mm-hmm. So the value of more liberty comes in proportion to the absence of liberty, or the absence of generalized prosperity. In places like Canada and the US, the perception and the sensation is that there is a significant amount of wealth to go around. In a place like Honduras or Haiti or other countries, there is clear acknowledgement that they're way below an acceptable level of human prosperity. It's not even debated that it's below the line of what it could be. In the US, nobody really thinks that the GDP per capita could be $500,000, although there's nothing to say that it can't be, but it's kind of invisible. Honduras compares itself to what is the GDP per capita in Costa Rica, which is like 3 times or 4 times greater. And obviously against the US, it's way higher. So there's a bigger gap. Thus, the benefit of economic liberty is tangible. You can explain it in tangible terms because there's a gap of known delta to be filled. So the reason why a country like Honduras would do something like this is because they know that there's a gap. You can empirically show the correlation between greater freedom and greater prosperity. And since you're not asking them to change the system nationally at the expense of vested interest, but rather do it at a very small scale and greenfield, there's basically only upside within important guardrails, right? That's why it has to be yet acceptable. It's not Wild West. It's not Libertopia. Do whatever the hell you want. It is within the boundaries of what has been approved. But that window of economic freedom is vast superior than elsewhere in the country. And actually, I would argue vast superior than anywhere else in the world, as far as I know.
So can you give us an idea just like of how big it is right now? Like the physical size and
sure.
How many people, I don't know, are they full-time residents, or is it like people just spend a few months of the year there? I mean, just that kind of.
Sure. The physical location, there's 2 ways of thinking about it. The land that is incorporated into the jurisdiction, and then the land that is together. So there is essentially 3 hubs, 3 groupings of land that will eventually be developed at city scale projects. The first one is here in Roatan, and that adds up to 420 acres as of today, but it's in the context of a master plan that will add up to almost 800 acres. For perspective, the size of Monaco is about 550 acres. So we're currently a bit smaller than Monaco in terms of landmass, but will build up to be about 30% larger than Monaco with a master plan that can sustain about double the Monaco population at full scale. How long it takes is totally, it depends on the market forces, how quickly the emergent order drives the build out of the physical locations. And we have a role to catalyze that. But that's location number 1. Location number 2 is on the mainland, east of the city of La Ceiba. And that is about just shy of 400 acres today. The master plan is limited to that, but there's a lot of open land around it. So other people can incorporate their land into the jurisdiction if they want to, or at least into the master plan. And that is designed to be a master plan of about 100,000 people. And the difference between these 2 is very similar to, say, how Hong Kong and Shenzhen relate to each other. Hong Kong is capital, talent, service economy on an island. In fact, the island of Roatan is 1 square mile larger than the island of Hong Kong. So they're very comparable sizes. Roatan has probably 75,000 residents, whereas the island of Hong Kong has about 1.2 million residents. And the island of Hong Kong occupies, really, with urban development, less than a third, probably more like 27% of the surface area, because the rest is reserved as parks. So Roatan has a lot of room to grow, basically, right? And that's where we're operating. On the mainland, the equivalent example of Shenzhen also plays out. There's more land, so it's cheaper. Access to mainland electricity, so it's cheaper. It's right next to a small city that is actually about the same size that Shenzhen was before it was converted into one of these special economic zones. It's in the 200,000 to 300,000 people range, and our development there is completely green land. We have not broken ground yet. We're waiting for some political uncertainties or frictions to pass over the coming couple of years. So that is raw and greenfield still. And the third is on another side of the island of Roatan, on the further east end of it. And if we were Manhattan, so I said Hong Kong, but the equivalent is if what we're building is Manhattan, then this would be, an outskirts of Manhattan, like the Hamptons, if you will. It's not intended to be like a city project. It's more intended to be lower density, higher end community will have a town center and what have you, but it's a much higher end community, lower density, whereas our core is a mixed use, low, middle, and high class, knowledge workers and students, and basically a small metropolis. In terms of people, we still don't have a large permanent population. We basically just finished building the first mixed-use tower, which is 14 stories high. It's twice as tall as anything else on the island, but it's still only 14 stories high. The tower that will follow is 19 stories high. That tower has 82 apartments. Most of them are occupied right now. Then on one of the resort properties that we own, there is about 83 private villas. Half of those are occupied most of the time, and the other half are rented by the owners, some people who come, say, for weekends, because we are in a beautiful Caribbean island. And then we have a hotel that has 55 beds, and it's going to be expanded to 75 soon. And we leverage that to host conferences and events like what I described earlier. I would say all in all, we probably have at least 300 to 400 people at various points in time throughout the year when there's peak presence here. But about half of them are here most of the time, whereas the rest are transient.
Okay, yeah, and just to underscore, you're saying it's a beautiful Caribbean island. I mean, it's looking at your website, it looks like it's just like a resort. Like, this is where you would go for a vacation. Like that's luscious views and fancy hotels and whatnot. So, what is your long-term vision? Like you mentioned Hong Kong. And I don't know if you know this, Eric, but when I was in grad school, I wrote a novel in like daydreaming as a budding anarcho-capitalist theorist about, in the story, some people go to a poor government and they carve out a little island in the Pacific and then make it into Ancapistan, and it and then things progress. So that I'm intrigued by what you're doing here because it's kind of similar. And so I had thought, and you mentioning Hong Kong, that in terms of besides just wealthy people resettling there, but in terms of like ongoing production, that are you picturing like a lot of financial services? Like eventually there'll be high-rise buildings with people doing financial service, just need internet access and computers, basically?
Yeah, knowledge work as the primary driver of job creation and GDP on the island. And knowledge work obviously can mean so many things, but in the short term, it's finance and healthcare. We are combining the resort properties with our capacity to support, cutting edge healthcare services, longevity, and what have you. And so there you got gene therapy, stem cell therapy. So people come here, like Brian Johnson came here a couple of times to get cutting edge technologies. They pay a lot for it, but then they also stay at the hotel. They consume. They indirectly or directly pay for governance services.
Okay, so because just to give the intuition in case the listeners aren't getting the point, that even if you do have this very low regulation or smart regulation, things that all make economic sense, like that's kind of the rationale of this, and the Honduran government sort of letting you guys do that because they realize this helps us if this works economically. Well,
it's more than a realization. The terms of the deal is that for jobs within the zone, 90% need to be Hondurans, unless it's proven that there's just not a Honduran available for a particular job. So for Honduras, it's a job creating program that also brings investment. And in our modality, the way you do that is by creating an environment of maximum economic freedom as a global competitive advantage to companies, particularly those that are in highly regulated industries. So by creating a fundamentally high value environment to do business in, we're not asking for charity. We're inviting companies to set up shop here to advance their strategy, at a lower cost with higher velocity, and sometimes actually being able to do things that otherwise they wouldn't be able to do. And so they come here, they end up hiring people and investing, but they're doing it to advance their fundamental economic objectives.
Right. Okay. Yes. Thank you for that. And then, but just to continue, so to try to look ahead and guess which type of companies would want to, relocate or start if it's a startup there. Things that are very real estate intensive, like cattle ranching probably wouldn't work so well, or like even maybe automobile manufacturing in terms of having big factories. But again, like skyscrapers where people are doing financial work that, you just need people sitting in a cubicle. Or when you said healthcare, I was like, oh yeah, right. Because you could get some of the best brain surgeons and heart surgeons in the world coming there, and you don't need that much square footage in order to have state-of-the-art facilities where people are doing, using nanobots to go in and repair people's arteries and things. So wealthy people from around the world could travel to you to get those surgeries and whatnot at very affordable prices given the quality, and that could be a great business model. And so that's what you're thinking. That would be one of your major...
yes, though it doesn't necessarily have to be super affordable. I mean, some of the therapists here are like ridiculously expensive.
No, but I was saying relative to the quality that they're getting.
The thing, I mean, sure, that happens, Bob, but there's some things here that just can't be done elsewhere. So when Brian Johnson came here and got gene therapies, that was the only place in the world that he can get that gene therapy for. Now, he paid probably $50,000 per shot. And, to me, that's insanely expensive. But the point is not whether it's expensive or cheap. It's literally he wouldn't be able to get that currently anywhere else in the world because of the way our regulatory environment works, which is not Wild West zero regulation. It is a reciprocal model. It's funny. It's like if you want to dilute something, you add more of it, Mm-hmm. So the way the regulatory apparatus works to make it impossible for businesses to prosper is they create a lot of red tape by having, I'm preaching to the choir, I know, to your audience, but if you think about the main problem includes that it's monopolistic. There's only one rule set that you must follow, and there's only one overseer that says that you're compliant or not. Okay, well, so you can try to get rid of it, and good luck with that. It's, it hasn't worked so far, and I don't think it'll work anytime soon. But what if instead you say, okay, great, you believe in regulation? Super. Then let's allow all regulations. Let's allow any regulatory framework from anywhere in the OECD world. Let's just start with that. And then let's add peer countries. All of a sudden, you multiply by 100 the level of choice, which means you also multiply by 100 the degree of freedom, which means that at least in healthcare right now, you can say this is the best place to do business in, full stop, because a doctor from anywhere in the world can practice here. Basically, I mean, like if they're licensed in OECD, they're a doctor, right? The drugs that are approved, the medical devices, the methodologies, if they're approved anywhere, they're automatically approved here. So you're leapfrogging in one location the best that there is already. So in a funny way, by opening it up to saying, no, regulations, okay, let's do more of it, but then let's give people choice. Let's not monopolize coercively. Let's give people choice. Obviously, following a bit of Rothbard's ideas of insurance as a mechanism to oversee that people are not causing negative externalities on third parties. But once you do that, you actually dilute the most perverse part of a regulatory state, which is not the intention of handling, say, health and safety of non-consenting third parties. That intention is valid. You would do it under private property anyways. The issue is that it's monopolized and coercive, but increase it substantially and then it goes away. It's interesting.
Okay, so if I'm sure many listeners are intrigued, so can you just give a little bit more details? If let's say somebody has a portfolio management company, and he realizes that, oh yeah, I could, especially because I could have some of my key people just do telework and whatever. But yeah, I would be willing to relocate my headquarters and so on. How does that work? Like, do they have to become citizens of Honduras, and how are they taxed and so forth?
Sure. To be in one of Prospera's city projects within Honduras, you have to be in Honduras legally. Okay, you can't just go to Prospera disregarding immigration laws. It's part of the attributions that the central government retains, immigration. But Honduras has never had a big problem with, let's say, too many people wanting to move to it. So their standards are fairly lax. It's fairly easy to get a residency, and there are various mechanisms to do it. You can do it as an investor. You could do it as a retiree. You could do it as an employee. I mean, it's also not that expensive, generally with $2,500 or thereabouts you get a residency, and it might take a while, like 6 months. They're not necessarily super fast, but once you apply and you get a certificate of having applied, you're basically legal to be in country as if you had the residency. It's not until it's denied, if it gets denied, that you no longer have that right. So getting the residency is fairly easy, and Próspera has a network of lawyers that are experts at it, and we work with them and they facilitate the transaction. But you do have to be a resident of Próspera in addition to having a Honduran residency. And that is because once you're doing business within Próspera, you're opting in to a whole legal system that you are consenting to. And part of what you're consenting to includes resolving disputes through the Próspera Arbitration Center. It's using the common law as a base legal standard. Obviously, for contracts, you have choice of law as you do anywhere else, mostly anywhere else. But what's unique here is that in addition to choice of law, you actually get choice of regulation, which is something that you don't get anywhere else in the world. You generally don't get to choose what regulations you want to follow. You are told this is the framework that you must comply with, or else. Here you choose, and this opens the spectrum significantly to the type of businesses that can come and do well. Something I want to underscore is that the reason, or the only way in which what we're doing works, and the reason why we're able to do it, it's because we're actually positioning these ideals that we know work very well as an engine for socioeconomic development. Okay, I mean that if these ideas are worth pursuing at scale, it better be because they drive more generalized prosperity. Individualism aside, I believe 100% in the sovereign individual, of course, but as a human level philosophy that's worthwhile pursuing, it better be because it generates more prosperity. And so because that is true, it is that which gives us, let's say, which justifies the charter, the concessions that we're getting it because on the other side of it, it's not about some wealthy individuals coming to have more freedom, period. It's because when you create that environment, you're going to improve the lives of thousands and thousands of Hondurans, which would otherwise not have a chance at getting a high-paying job. Okay, so that is the main KPI with government when it's all said and done, is how many jobs are you creating and what's the average salary that they're earning without forcing people to pay X, Y, or Z. So you opt into the legal system, you become, by becoming a resident of it. And once you're in, you can do all sorts of things. I mean, the industries that are working best right now are in healthcare because of the high regulatory burden that they face in the US and the amount of time that it takes for the FDA to approve drugs, even though they might be demonstrably safe. They also want to validate your claims of efficacy. They want to get in the middle of that communication, which, as we know well, it's more than adequately handled through fraud standards and common law. Here, you can do it much faster and cheaper, while still being at the highest level of safety and health considerations for non-consenting third parties.
Okay, well, great. So, I suppose another thing people are wondering is, and you kind of alluded to this with the Hong Kong model, is that following, I'll throw this out there and then you can refine it, that presumably the Chinese government is not going to go in and completely upset the Hong Kong or model, regardless of claims of sovereignty or whatnot, just because they realize this is the golden goose. And if they came in and cracked down too heavily, that would ruin the engine of economic growth that Hong Kong provides to everybody around. And so likewise here is part of the defense in terms of people wondering, like, well, gee, it's kind of a small little thing. And if we get too wealthy, won't the Honduras, the next administration in Honduras, won't they just come in and grab everything? But that would be pretty short-sighted. Is that part of the rationale?
Yeah, it is. Although that rationale works in theory over, let's say, prolonged period of time, but it's not a sufficient driver because political actors are not economically rational actors. They have other incentives, and power obviously is higher value than economic prosperity for the population. And so we're facing some of that right now in Honduras. And frankly, I don't have the answer as to how exactly it's going to turn out, but what I can tell you is that we're having to write the book as we go, and literally, because it's happening in reality, and that in theory and so far validated in practice, if you do your homework up front and set the right structures legally, leveraging the same legal institutions that other key actors in the international arena require in order for them to operate, then a threat against you that violates those institutional structures is a threat against everybody else in the system. So, it's no longer just about an individual actor. It's about the concept of sovereign contracts, legal stability, international treaties. And so we have been fortunate and successful at wrapping what we're doing in very solid legal foundations that include things like international treaties, which other states, other countries around the world, other nation states depend upon to regulate the relationship between them. So we are in a situation where to violate our arrangements, not only Honduras, but other actors that are part of the World Bank have to agree almost to let a state go rogue with the same legal instruments that all the other states depend upon to hold each other to account. So that's one dimension of making sure, they don't kind of kill the golden goose, the goose that lays the golden eggs. But I would argue there's more to be done. Certainly, having higher KPIs, so growing faster, in an ideal scenario is part of it. You sort of become too big to destroy in the short term because too many Hondurans have jobs and then they would vote out the politicians that take the jobs away. We're not there yet. So look, I don't have all the answers, but I can tell you it's been a hell of a ride. And so far, we have succeeded. We're still standing and we're moving in the right directions. If this were an investor pitch, I would be showing you graphs with KPIs that are up and to the right, whether it's number of residents, land incorporated, economic activity generated, buildings built. I mean, fortunately, all the KPIs are up and to the right.
By the way, you keep using that for people not in the business world. KPI is what? Key performance indicator?
Yes.
And so the idea, like if you hire a new employee at a company, they might say, here are your KPIs, showing them this is what we're all agreeing on the front end. This is what we mean by your success here at this company. So everybody's in agreement. And then the employee knows if I just do well on these 5 areas, then, they're happy with me and my job security is assured and so forth. So you're just saying with the Honduras government, you guys agree on the front end, this is what we're going to do for you. And they say, yeah, you go ahead and do that. And then you're just saying, as long as we keep hitting that out of the park.
Yeah, and more than just with the Honduran government, as a for-profit enterprise, what is it that we need to be succeeding at to eventually get to the end results? And those are leading indicators. Ultimately, it's bottom line profit, right? But what are the leading indicators? And those include, how much land is in the jurisdiction? The more the better. How many buildings are built? The more the better. How many people are registered to do business? The more the better. How much actual business are they doing? The more the better. Of that business, how much is paying for the services of governance? The more the better. So eventually, it all adds up to profit. But in the beginning, as any startup or enterprise, you're not running out of profit. You're investing to set foundations, scale out, and then you hit profit. So you need something in the middle, in between, to guide you to the North Star of succeeding with the fundamentals. Great.
You had mentioned this, am I understanding right? It's not that this is just your one baby, that as you continue to, if this works, you have plans of copying this model elsewhere around the world?
Yeah, we have affiliated entities that have the right to deploy the same technology elsewhere in the world using the same business model.
Okay. Are you at a stage where, like, for people who live in Asia or something and they know they're not going to make this move, like, do you have anything? Are you at the stage to say, here's some locations where we're looking at, or is it not that stage yet?
On the website, there's a place for them to register to say get the newsletter, and so that would be one fairly passive way to stay informed. Another is to follow Prosper Global on X, formerly Twitter. But we are involved in various initiatives around the world, be it in Africa, or the one that I'm really, really excited about, the U.S. Under President Trump, there is a desire to come up with an out-of-the-box way of catalyzing more freedom. Mm-hmm. He did a speech on freedom cities, but the legal and policy work was not created. So we're helping on that structure based on our experience. There are efforts in the Middle East. I mean, there's interest in a lot of places. Some of it premature to disclose publicly, but if you're part of the of the newsletter, when they become public, you'll be amongst the first to find out.
Okay, we'll include links, folks, but it's prospera.co is the main website. So prospera.co is where you want to go to get all these things. I guess the last question I had for you, Eric, is we're winding up here. What was your background? I mean, you made a reference to Rothbard. Can you just explain a little bit? How did you go from being I think you said at one time you dabbled in socialism growing up in Venezuela. How did you discover the Austrian school and, I guess, libertarianism?
Through firsthand personal experience and just that not matching at all what the typical economist professors in college would talk about with Keynesian economics and central planning and then the philosophy of why you need a public and for politics government to counter the greedy businessman. Just my own personal experience of being a young entrepreneur myself showed me that was BS. That there's perhaps nothing more generous and more serviceable than being an entrepreneur. As long as you're not leveraging the state or other means of coercion, if you're doing it truly voluntarily, then you are an agent of good by definition. And if you are a Christian or religious in any way, then there's only so much good you can do as a private citizen. But if you build an enterprise around you with economies of scale and dedicated people, then you multiply the amount of good that you can do in the world. So in any and every dimension that I experienced, what it actually meant to be in business is really to be at the service of people that you choose to serve and they choose to be served by you. And anybody that told me that was evil or that needed to be restrained or overseen because otherwise you abuse people, to me just had no freaking clue, or at least it did not align with my experience or reality, except for when businesses were in bed with governments and they were big and they had licenses and there was some form of coercion, either through monopolies or worse. Then you have the problem. But the solution did not make sense to do more of the source of the problem, but to do less of it, right? And yet the institutions that government manages that we take for granted sometimes, which are essential for private property and for trade, and just to hold each other accountable peacefully without having to recourse to the gun, justice and private property and the registries. Like, these things require infrastructure that is not typically provided by economic actors. Okay, you don't go into a company and agree which registry you're going to use for your transaction. There's a registry that is bigger than the two economic actors. So in recognizing that those infrastructure assets are essential for modern civilization, and then realizing that they are in the hands of public and for politics institutions, and that those exist supposedly to do things that don't need to be done, interfere in voluntary trade amongst consenting individuals. It just all made sense, pragmatically. And then I was fortunate to be guided. There was one professor in particular, and may he rest in peace. He died way too early, but he was an ANCAP, Larry Moss from Babson. And, he without using any labels, he just, at various interactions, I think he felt that I intuitively was getting it. And he just let me follow my instincts. He didn't ask me to read Human Action or, any of these books. He just let me work it out as an entrepreneur would. And honestly, that stuck much deeper than I think it would have worked if I was just reading some thick books as a 20-something year old. So that's the source of it. I've been fortunate to now surround myself with people who are far smarter than I am and better read, and both in the legal field and the philosophy field and in economics generally. So I often find words to describe what just makes sense that are not my own, but it's my own experience primarily that has gotten me here.
Okay, well, that's very exciting, and wish you the best of luck going forward. This is a fascinating project. Folks, my guest has been Erick Brimen, who is the CEO of Honduras Próspera. Erick, thanks so much for what you've been doing and coming here to tell us about it.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me. And those of you who are interested in getting involved and actually transform theory and ideas into practice, do become involved. It's, I think, the only project currently in the world that is as close to the ideals that we share, but that is going about it in a very pragmatic way.
Very well put. And thanks, everybody, for tuning in. We'll see you next time.
Check back next week for a new episode of the Human Action Podcast. In the meantime, you can find more content like this on Mises.org.